Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so excited that so many of you could join us today for the future of psychedelic-assisted therapy. I'm Alex Elliott, the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Rick Doblin and Gisele Fernandes-Osterhold, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Gisele Fernandes-Osterhold is a licensed psychotherapist, clinical supervisor, and graduate-level psychology professor. Gisele's personal approach to healing is rooted in her commitment to embodied spirituality, informed by her practices of yoga, dance, and indigenous traditions of her native Brazil. Besides her psychotherapy practice, Gisele serves as core faculty member at the Integral Counseling Psychology program at CIIS, a mentor at the Center for Psychedelic Therapies and Research at CIIS, and a clinical supervisor at the SAGE Institute. Rick Doblin is the founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. He received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His professional goal is to help develop legal contexts for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic therapist. He founded MAPS in 1986 and currently resides in Boston. And now let me turn it over to Gisele and Rick.
Good evening, everybody. Hi, Rick. It's
Hello,
so nice.
Gisele. Yes.
So nice to be here with you tonight in this virtual event to talk about the therapeutic use of psychedelics in clinical context. That's something that goes back to the 50s, and you founded MAPS in 1986 and have been dedicated more than 3 decades to rekindling the therapeutic use of psychedelics. We're now at a moment with so many innovative research studies with psychedelics all over the country and the world. There are changes in law enforcement with measures to decriminalize psychedelics, and a tremendous interest in the healing potential for psychedelics in the mainstream society and media. We are living a psychedelic renaissance. How do you understand the potential for the therapeutic use of psychedelics in this moment in history?
Well, I would say that in this moment in history, humanity is in a car speeding over the cliff. The planet is at risk. We're destroying and killing innumerable species are dying. It's a great massive die-off. We have incredible destructive technology in terms of weaponry. There's just a need for humanity to become more spiritual, become more compassionate, become more tolerant of differences, to really understand our common humanity, and that we're part of the web of life on Earth, and that we're not disconnected from nature. And so it's a question, will humanity survive? And how many species will we take down with us if we don't? But the potential is that we can wake up spiritually, that we can also work through all of the multi-generational traumas that have been tumbling down through history for thousands of years, and that we can move forward in a more compassionate, collective manner, so that we both understand our commonality, but also appreciate our differences rather than be scared by our differences. And I think there are many tools that can help us to make this transition. And psychedelics are one of the most reliable, effective, and powerful of all the tools that are available to us. And so I think the psychedelic renaissance is a sign of great hope and optimism that we will be able to find ways to use these tools in productive contexts, both as medicines. That's primarily what we'll be talking about, is developing these drugs as therapeutic tools, but also finding numerous sort of spiritual religious contexts, and then also through drug policy reform and eventual license legalization for people to use them throughout the lifespan for personal growth, for vision questing, for couples therapies, for all sorts of things. And what I also hope, we're doing a study with Israelis and Palestinians who are doing is ayahuasca and MDMA together, small groups of it. So we think that psychedelics could be great for psychedelic reconciliation between cultures. And one of the metaphors I think that's been so powerful for me to be thinking about is when we talk about the environment, we talk about climate change, we talk about becoming sort of carbon neutral or net zero for carbon, but think about it as being trauma neutral or trauma zero. How do we develop a society that's not producing more traumas, that's not emitting traumas, that's trauma neutral? And I think that psychedelics can play a big role in that transition.
Yeah, so if we start with this large vision, this context of psychedelics bringing psychological healing mixed with spiritual experiences, what is the connection of that with political action? Do you think psychedelics can help us evolve to face the challenges of this time?
Yeah, well, I think first off, let's look back to the 60s, where psychedelics really emerged in more popular awareness. Psychedelics have been going for thousands of years and have been used in all different contexts. But I think in the Western world, there was this big explosion of interest in psychedelics in the 60s. And it turned out that a lot of the people that used them had these spiritual experiences and then got involved in political struggles, particularly opposing the Vietnam War, working on women's rights, civil rights, the environmental movement. And the culture at the time wasn't really prepared for it, either for the kind of challenging of the status quo, or also wasn't prepared really for the kind of psychological material that psychedelics could bring forth. I mean, in the 60s, women were tranquilized to give birth. Men were not allowed in the delivery room in the Western world. The first hospice was until 1974. And so death was something that was not really talked about. Meditation and yoga were scary to a lot of people. There was a lot of resistance to them. They weren't widespread. We had people in these silly robes coming from India and, telling us about transcendental meditation, or, people were scared if you did yoga, you would be falling victim to be turning into a Buddhist or a Hindu or something, that you'd lose your religious orientation. So I think that psychedelics, when they first came, did have a spiritual element that did motivate people for action in the world. And I think now we have made incredible progress in many ways in culture, is that you can go to the YMCA and learn meditation. And yoga, mindfulness has been mainstreamed. We see it all over the place. Yoga is very comfortable. We have over 6,000 hospices. We have a new approach to death and new approaches to birth. And we've integrated pretty much everything, even when we think about art and movies and imagery. The psychedelic kind of imagery has appeared in a lot of our art and movies and advertising. So we've basically integrated everything except for the psychedelics. And so that's why I think we're going to be able to do it. And also, I think the political understanding that I've sort of the lessons from the 60s is that if you self-identify as part of a counterculture, that you build a certain kind of resistance, and the culture is more dominant and will suppress and block. So what we're talking about really now is the mainstreaming of psychedelics woven into the heart of the culture, not being seen as something that necessarily is involved with tearing down the structures, but that is more about evolution rather than revolution. And I think the decision for me when I was 18 in 1972 to devote my life to psychedelics was precisely because of the political aspect of it. I really felt that we are causing a lot of problems by how we identify ourselves in these limited ways, by our race, by our gender, by our religion, by our nationality, by our socioeconomic status. Now, these are all important ways to know who we are, to differentiate, to become who we are, but we've often lost track of the common elements that bind us together, the common humanity, the common life on earth, the connection with nature. And so I think that it's that experience of that commonality seemed to me when I was 18 as the antidote to genocide, to the Holocaust, to nuclear destruction, to racism. And so I think it's precisely the political aspects of psychedelics that really motivated me. And then I see the medicalization and the use as therapy as a tool to try to bring about a larger move towards mass mental health or mass spiritualization, you could say. Albert Einstein said that our technology has exceeded our humanity. And so I see that what we need to do with psychedelics is expand our humanity.
Beautiful. So that's some differences between what we're living right now and the 60s. And how about some differences between the MDMA, which is the main medicine used in the studies and the trials? We're going to get deep into that in a minute in our conversation. And what's considered the classical psychedelics like LSD or DMT or mescaline or psilocybin. You want to say something about how does the MDMA change the brain and the therapeutic effects in contrast?
Yeah, well, to use another kind of a metaphor, I'll say that the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, which comes from peyote, ayahuasca, ibogaine, the classic psychedelics are ego dissolving. And they kind of move you towards this larger flow. Aldous Huxley talked about the brain as a reducing valve. And so the modern neuroscience has demonstrated that there's a series of structures in the brain that are called the default mode network that are somewhat equivalent to our ego, to our sense of self. And the classic psychedelics reduce activity in the default mode network so that we don't filter all the information the way we normally do. And so this is where we can get into Abraham Maslow and humanistic and transpersonal psychology, where, Maslow, many of us know about the hierarchy of needs, which has been portrayed often in a pyramid with your basic survival needs. And then you move up to self-esteem, to belonging, and eventually there was self-actualization. And that's sort of the basis for humanistic psychology. In the last few years of Abraham Maslow's life, in consultation with Stan Grof and others, they formed a transpersonal psychology, and the top of it was now self-transcendence. It was no longer self-actualization, but it was self-transcendence. So the classic psychedelics move you in this kind of ego-dissolving way. MDMA acts completely differently. MDMA doesn't really do ego dissolution in that same way. What it does is it centers us in our ego in such a comfortable and loving and self-accepting way that then we can open up to the larger world, and we can open up to other people that we may be in dialogue with. We can become better listeners. We can become speaking more honestly without so many worries about what we'll say or what people will say in response. And so MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala, which is the fear processing part of the brain. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, where we think logically. And then MDMA also increases connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus to help us take traumatic memories and move them into long-term storage. MDMA also stimulates oxytocin, which is the hormone of love, nursing mothers. It's the hormone of connection. There's been Doblin, a great neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins, has given mice MDMA, and shown that it releases the oxytocin, and then it produces new neural connections in prosocial areas of the brain and opens up a critical reward period for connecting with others. So they all deserve, I think, the word psychedelic in that category. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. That's how the word was originally created. Humphrey Osmond wrote a poem to Aldous Huxley, to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. And Delios to reveal or to manifest, psyche, the mind. So it's the mind manifesting. And so I think MDMA does it in a different way than the classic psychedelics. MDMA being more gentle, being less of a distance from our normal way of processing, just kind of less fear, defensiveness, more self-love, more acceptance. I think it's easier to integrate the lessons from MDMA than it is from the classic psychedelics. And that's why I think, because of its gentleness and ease to integrate, that's one of the reasons why I felt that MDMA would be the psychedelic that would go first through the system. The other thing I'll just say is that we believe that therapists who want to work with these substances would be more effective if they've had a chance to do them themselves and knew what they were doing. I mean, you wouldn't go to a meditation teacher that never meditated or a yoga teacher that never did yoga. I don't think it's essential for therapists to do these drugs to be good therapists, but I think it would be helpful to them. And I think there's going to be less resistance in the field of psychiatry and psychotherapy for them to try MDMA than there is to try psilocybin or LSD, which are more challenging in the sense of letting go of how we normally see things. So people tend to feel more in control in a way under MDMA. Although in therapy settings, when traumatic memories or other kind of difficult things are emerging, people still need to learn the art and the skill of letting go, of having these experiences manifest fully.
So we'll get into the training of therapists and the skills that needs to be in place and developed in a moment. But let's start out with MAPS and the research that's happening that is now in phase 3. And it's happening here in the United States, in Canada, and in Israel.
Yeah.
And it's a revolutionary contribution to the fields of psychology and psychiatry. If we know that in psychiatry, for the treatment of severe depression, the most established treatment has been electroshock, ECT. And so as MDMA comes into proposing a treatment, it's really a huge change in the field. And so we'll address that in a minute. But I would like you to speak about where the research is at in phase 3 at this moment. What are the expected outcomes and what's next?
Well, okay, so I started MAPS in 86. It took us 30 years to have what's called an end of phase 2 meeting with FDA, which was November 29th, 2016. That's where we did preclinical studies, learning about toxicity. We did basic phase 1 safety studies in humans. Then we started working in patients, and we refined our approach for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. Once we negotiated this end of phase 2 meeting with FDA, and then they said we can go into phase 3, we negotiated all of the studies that we need to do to make the drug into a medicine, assuming the data turns out. And we agreed to do 2 100-person phase 3 studies. So basically 200 people in phase 3, 2 100-person phase 3 studies. The FDA said to us that they felt that we could prove efficacy with smaller numbers than they wanted to see for safety. And so we have to do these 2 100-person studies. We also negotiated with FDA that we could do what's called an interim analysis of each of these phase 3 studies. And that's for what's called sample size re-estimation. So in a way, it's a gift to the pharmaceutical companies that if your original study with the size that you've developed that is not going towards statistical significance, you can add extra people into your study. So the purpose of the interim analysis is to see if you need to add people to get statistical significance. And so we had the interim analysis for our first phase 3 study in March of this year. The FDA has only granted 2 drugs breakthrough therapy for PTSD. One is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's not really a drug, it's psychotherapy that the drug makes more effective. The other was a repurposed sleeping pill from about 30 years ago. The theory was it helps people not have the nightmares, that then they can get over some of their PTSD symptoms. That was done by Tonix Pharmaceuticals. They had their interim analysis in February, and they were told to shut the study down for futility. The drug didn't work after they'd spent substantially over $100 million. So our interim analysis was the opposite. It was the best possible news that we could get. It was that we didn't need to add anybody to our study, that we had a 90% or greater probability of success once we were to complete the whole study, at least a medium effect size. So effect size is a measure of the magnitude of the clinical impact. That was in March. Right after we got the interim analysis, things got shut down because of COVID, and research shut down. And we had some people in the midst of treatment, but we were able to continue with some of them. Others didn't want to continue. Some of the therapists didn't want to continue. And the FDA reached out to us and to other sponsors of different research, and they said, because of COVID, we would give you the opportunity to negotiate with us to end the study sooner than you would have otherwise. And so we thought about it a lot, and we decided to enter into these negotiations. And so we agreed with FDA that we would end the study with 90 people instead of 100. And we did that, completed all those people in August. We've been analyzing the data since then, and this discussion that we're having is only 1 week away. On October 30th, we are going to find out if our first of 2 phase 3 studies was statistically significant. And if so, that means in conjunction with the safety data that it is a successful study. And then we just have to do 1 more phase 3 study and some associated other studies, and then present the data to the FDA to try to make the drug into a medicine. We've already started the second phase 3 study, just barely. We've got 14 sites, 2 in Israel, 1 in Canada, and 11 throughout the United States. We have about 8 of them are enrolling, are trying to screen and enroll subjects now. The rest of them will hopefully come online in the next couple months. We think by the end or beginning to middle of 2022 is when we think we're going to finish with the second phase 3 study. And then we submit all the data to FDA, and we hope by the beginning of 2023 that we'll have approval for prescription use. We're also starting research in Europe. So we have negotiated with the European Medicines Agency, and they gave us permission to move forward to phase 3 in Europe. And they said that they will accept all the data from the FDA, and therefore we only need to do 1 phase 3 study in Europe, and it only needs to be 70 people. So what we're doing now is we're working at 10 sites in 7 countries in Europe, and we are in the what's called the open label phase 2 stage. It's about training of therapists. The last step of training therapists is to supervise them as they work with the PTSD patients. And then we have our team watch the videotapes and give them tips about our therapeutic method.
Very exciting. So let's talk about the context in which this research happens, in which this healing and these outcomes that will be soon made available and hopefully approved by the FDA. The importance of the set and setting in these studies, the presence of 2 therapists, the music, the preparation, the integration sessions, as well as the 3 different moments in which the patient takes the medicine. So would you give the audience a clear picture of what a treatment looks like?
Yeah. So the first thing I think I need to say is that our operating principle has been, how do we maximize therapeutic outcomes? How do we get the best results? When you're moving forward with something that's controversial, that has been suppressed by society, where there's a lot of fears built up, we need to get the best outcomes, and we also need to work with the hardest patients and patients that are appreciated by the public. so what we've decided to do is to develop a therapeutic process that takes about 3.5 months. There are 3 day-long MDMA sessions, each 8 hours. In most of our sites, we actually ask the patients to stay overnight in the treatment center to rest, and then the very next day there's an integrative work as well. So 3 day-long MDMA sessions, 3 to 5 weeks apart, and there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions as well. 3 roughly on a weekly basis before the first MDMA session, and that's to develop a therapeutic alliance and to teach people what they can expect under MDMA, how to process bodily feelings and emotions and thoughts as they come up, and for the therapist to really understand better where the patients are coming from. And then we have 3 of these 90-minute sessions after each MDMA session, again, more or less a week apart, to help with the integration. And then we have a follow-up, which is what's called the primary outcome measure, is 2 months after the last MDMA session. And that's going to be where we compare the group that gets therapy without MDMA versus the group that gets therapy with MDMA. And that's going to be the data at the 2 months follow-up for whether it gets approved by the FDA. We also do a 12-month follow-up, which is more for insurance companies to try to show that it's durable, or is it durable, and to what number of patients relapse, how many, on average, what we've shown is that people keep getting better, and that the 12 months results are even better than the 2-month results. Now, that's the structure of the intervention. The other part of this is that we've decided to work with 2 therapists. Now, not always male-female team, or however, but we're open to all genders or non-genders, non-binary, but in general, our standard model is somebody who identifies as a man, somebody who identifies as a woman. And the reason is that it's 8-hour sessions. People get tired. Somebody goes to the bathroom. Somebody gets something to eat. We want there to be always a therapist in the room. It's not absolutely essential, but it's better. And then also, many of us suffer trauma in our life, but only a fraction of people develop PTSD. And those people that develop PTSD are often people that have had a series of traumas, not always, but often, that go into childhood. So to have a well-functioning male-female team can actually offer a kind of balanced support that people might not have got when they were growing up. Also, about 60-65% of the subjects are women. And for women who've been sexually abused or assaulted, or to just have a one male therapist, might not be as safe or as supportive as having a woman in the room. For veterans who have war-related PTSD, sometimes for them, having a woman in the room is kind of permission to feel more that they might not have had otherwise, and also then they can relate to the male sometimes to the woman. So where we're going to go forward with this is that we think the standard model is going to be 2 sessions, 2 MDMA sessions, not 3, and 9 non-drug psychotherapy sessions. We don't really want the 1 session model, the 1 session miracle cure. There are people that do great with 1 session, and that may be enough for a lot of people. But we see that people go deeper on the 2nd session. They've learned about what the drug does. They've learned about how to process emotions under the influence of MDMA. They've learned to trust the therapists. And so we see that the 2nd session often goes deeper than the 1st session. So that's the basic structure.
Great. And you were mentioning the population served, right?
Yeah.
Veterans, women. How do they arrive at the clinical trials? Are they self-referred? And also the results of this population that have been a part of the MAPS clinical trials, is this outcome easily transferable to any individual in society, or is this kind of treatment just good under certain conditions to treat certain populations with PTSD?
Well, one of the things that you do in phase 2 is you try to figure out who's your patient population, who's going to respond, who's not going to respond. There's 2 drugs that are approved by the FDA for PTSD, both SSRIs, Zoloft and Paxil. Those drugs worked better in women than in men, and they failed in combat-related PTSD. So what we did in our phase 2 studies, our first study was with women with complex PTSD from childhood sexual abuse, adult rape and assault, and we showed that it worked great in that population. And near the end of that, we enrolled 1 or 2 veterans. Then we've also done studies in first responders, in veterans, firefighters, and police officers. And what we found is that it worked great in that population. We've had people that have had PTSD from a whole range of experiences, car accidents, natural disasters. And so our main finding was that we can enroll people with PTSD from any cause. And not only that, we can enroll people who have had PTSD recently. We have to take people that are chronic. That means at least 6 months PTSD, but we can also treat people that have had PTSD for 40 years. We've had people from Vietnam that are able to get over PTSD. So even though you're stuck in certain kind of patterns, emotional and mental patterns for decades and decades and decades, it's still possible to heal. And so I think that we now have that ability in phase 3 to enroll people with PTSD from any cause. Now, how do they come to us? Some of them are coming to us because of therapists that we've reached out to send us their patients who are non-responders. So we work with a lot of trauma therapists, and again, we say, send us your hardest cases. We have been trying to spread the word in the veterans community. And so a lot of people are referred by others that they've heard from that have been through our treatments. There's an awful lot of media that we have. Like, for example, I said next week on Friday, we're going to find out if our first phase 3 study was statistically significant. We've given the New York Times an exclusive on that. And so in the middle of November, there's going to be a New York Times article about whether our first phase 3 study was statistically significant. And sometimes people will see those media articles and then they will contact us. There's also something people should know about. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website that lists all the clinical research that's going on, not just in the United States, but a lot of it in around the world as well. Pharmaceutical sponsors are now obligated to put their studies on clinicaltrials.gov. But you can, people can go to clinicaltrials.gov and put PTSD in one of the search terms, or you could put PTSD and then MDMA in another of the search terms, and you will find out all the MDMA PTSD studies, or you will find out just all the PTSD studies. So some people find us through clinicaltrials.gov, and then through all the different sites. Occasionally we would try to do local advertising. I think it's very important that from our drug development perspective, that we enroll people as quickly as possible. Then it's less expensive for us, the sooner that we can do it. So we're looking for all those people that are listening now that may be treating trauma patients to think about referring them to our studies. And if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you'll find it's called MAP2, M-A-P-P, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, MAP2. And it lists all the cities, and there's contact information for the study coordinators at each site to have patients start the screening process.
Mm-hmm. And so the main clinical focus of the research has been for individuals suffering from PTSD. But there's also other studies that have been done with treatment-resistant depression, with eating disorders, with substance abuse. Could you speak a little bit about the variety of research findings with the use of MDMA?
Yeah, yeah. I realized that I didn't quite give the results either, which you asked. So let me just say that the results that we presented to FDA for our phase 2 results. Now, again, for phase 2, we work with treatment-resistant, chronic, on average, severe, and unlike a lot of PTSD studies, we enroll people who have previously attempted suicide. We don't exclude them. And so we're using a 3-session model. It's basically 42 hours of therapy over this 3.5-month period. What we showed is that 23% of the people that got the therapy without active MDMA, either very low dose MDMA or no MDMA at all, 23% of them no longer had PTSD at the 2-month follow-up, which is really, really good. These are treatment resistant people, on average, severe, chronic PTSD. So 23% of them no longer have PTSD. And this is not really due to MDMA. This is due to the therapy itself. When you add MDMA, 56% no longer have PTSD at the 2-month follow-up, more than double. And at the 1-year follow-up, 68% no longer have PTSD. People learn how to process their trauma and they keep getting better. Right, so that's the basic results, and we'll find out more when we see how our first phase 3 study did. We have also done studies with people with life-threatening illnesses who are anxious about dying, anxious about their illness with MDMA. That paper has just been accepted for publication in scientific reports, so that will be coming out fairly soon. We've done studies with autistic adults with social anxiety. So it was a study focused on social anxiety, and those results were tremendous. That's also been published. We're about to start studies with MDMA for eating disorders, but we don't have any results. But there are anecdotal reports of people with eating disorders who've tried MDMA and found it to be particularly helpful. We also have been associated with, we've not funded it, but we've provided MDMA and trained the therapists. Ben Sessa in England did a study that was MDMA for alcoholics. So what he found is that if you help people who've just been detoxed from alcohol process their traumas, their difficult emotions, then they don't feel the need to escape so much in alcohol or other addictive behaviors. So we're doing a long-term, we funded Ben to do a long-term follow-up to that, which he's in the process of doing, and the results look pretty good. We've actually very good. We've not done studies with depression. Most of the people in the PTSD studies also have depression, and the depression goes down quite a bit, but the primary outcome has been PTSD. So we've not done any studies yet with depression by itself. That's more been the studies by USONA, Hefter, and Compass, the different groups that are doing work with psilocybin for depression. Compass doing psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, USONA for major depressive disorder. And I would say that one of the most important developments in the history of the last 30, 40 years of psychiatry has been the development of ketamine for the treatment of depression. It's more rapid acting, and even though the results fade with a series of ketamine experiences, sometimes people can get over their depression. What we're finding is that when you combine ketamine with therapy, it works a lot better and you don't need as much ketamine. But the pharmaceutical company, Johnson & Johnson, that approved as ketamine doesn't understand psychotherapy. So they just deliver it as, like you said before about electroconvulsive therapy for depression, that's how they see ketamine. It's like, it's just a shock to your brain, and they don't think it matters your subjective effect. I think they're completely wrong about that, but sometimes people are able to get better that way. And we also want to look at group therapy. That's going to be the other big thing that we need to go into exploring. And MDMA for couples therapy, MDMA for even autoimmune disorders, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome. There's postpartum depression, I think MDMA would be great for. There's going to be so many uses for MDMA, but we felt that MDMA for PTSD was the opening wedge.
Wonderful, fantastic results. Yeah, last month during the interdisciplinary conference on psychedelic research, I heard about the study currently being done in Canada with cognitive behavioral co-joint
Yes,
therapy,
yes, yes.
right? Because when the person is traumatized, it has an impact on their relationships, on their partnerships, on their families. And so this model was talking about the use of MDMA in couples therapy.
Well, I would say that you know, since 1990, we have been trying to do work inside the VA system with MDMA. We're very close to starting that in the next couple of months. So it's a 30-year process. But about 7 years ago, when we were negotiating with the VA, they said that they weren't going to pay for anything, but we could work with one of their researchers, Candace Monson, who developed cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, and we could work with her to blend MDMA with her therapy, and that she had to do it outside of the VA. No subjects would come from the VA. VA wouldn't pay anything, but um, so it's tremendous. And recently, Candace and I presented to the Boston VA, and she presented all the results that she did developing cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy without MDMA, and then she presented the results when she blended MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, and the results were better than anything she got before. Candace is now the president of the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, which is the largest group in the world of PTSD researchers and clinicians. Now, getting MDMA approved by the FDA and then covered by insurance for couples therapy is not likely to happen because couples therapy is not a disease. Unfortunately, we can only treat diseases. You know, PTSD is considered a disease, a difficult relationship, feels like a disease, but it's not considered a disease. So with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy, we're sort of backing into couples therapy because we give both members of this dyad, one who has PTSD, one who's been affected by it, both of them get MDMA and their relationships improve. The PTSD improves even better. It's a tremendous modality. And I think one of the reasons why I think we need drug policy reform as well as medicalization is that there's so many uses of psychedelics that are not diseases that we need to find legal context for people to have access to them. And for therapists to be able to work with them. Maybe insurance would cover it, maybe not, but it's hard to see getting it through the FDA for certain things.
Okay, so the clinical trials have been tied down to the possibility of a diagnosis and being able to study the reduction of symptoms. And in that, the focus has been in individual treatment. But
Yeah.
from what you're sharing, the understanding of the impact of trauma on partnerships, on family members, and the possibility of group psychotherapy for more access and affordability are all being considered and are possibilities for the future. Is that right?
Yeah, very much so. So we're talking about a possible project, one at the Portland VA, one at the Bronx VA, where we study group therapy as well. A lot of times, I think individual therapy will be more effective than group therapy. There may be ways that we can leverage the group to optimize outcomes, but I think there's less individual attention. But if group therapy is 80% as good as individual therapy, but it's 20% the cost, that's going to be a profound benefit. You know, there's 8 million people with PTSD in the United States, as the National Center for PTSD at the VA has estimated. The other thing is that we're trying to work in Africa and in Europe with traumatized populations. When the European Medicines Agency said that for this phase 3 study in Europe, they want us to study refugees and migrants as well, that we could bring them in because they're so heavily traumatized. You know, in Rwanda, where there was genocide, in South Africa, where there was apartheid, in Somaliland, where there's just massive violence and PTSD. We need to find new models because they don't have hardly any psychiatrists or psychotherapists, and they have massive numbers of people that are traumatized. So that's where we need sort of like indigenous healers or other kind of models that we will develop that would most likely involve groups and may not be strictly supervised by psychiatrists or licensed psychotherapists. In the US, where there are a lot of psychiatrists and psychotherapists, we still really am very interested in trying to see how we can develop group therapy. There have been some models of group therapy where there is the group comes together, there is group preparation, then there is individual sessions. Then they come together for group integration. But we've never had really a group of people treated at the same time. Now you go to ayahuasca circles or peyote, Native American Church peyote circles, groups are taking it at the same time. But there's not as much of a therapeutic intervention. It's more about religious services, and there is a lot of healing. But we want to see what we can do with groups with significant and severe psychiatric indications as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot in there, and I hope that some of that focus for groups and traumatized communities are also the focus here in the United States, because we do have a lot of immigrants and people of color and lots of populations who have been systemically traumatized and could use that support in formats that are clinical and also non-clinical ways.
Yeah.
Like you said, community-based and other ways. But if we can just stay with the clinical aspect for a little bit longer, because conducting psychedelic sessions is not a classic clinical experience. Then with the development of the field of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy for individuals, for couples, for groups, there has to be the development of training. So what are and you have mentioned that you believe that it's important for therapists to have that experience themselves, to have that awareness, that the experience of being in non-ordinary spaces of consciousness and having their own healing done that way. But what are the other important skills that you think therapists would have to have? What's involved in the training? And who do you think would be assuring safety and ethical standards for the use of MDMA in psychotherapy?
Well, what we want to do is similar to what's happened for integrative medicine. So complementary and integrative medicine has become its own specialty. But it's taken 40 years for that to happen. What we want is a new specialty, psychedelic psychotherapy. And what we find is that those people that are working with ketamine, or those people that were working with MDMA, that the therapists really want to be cross-trained to be able to work with ketamine, with psilocybin, with MDMA. It's really about developing the field of psychedelic psychotherapy. We have to bring drugs through the FDA, through the regulatory systems, one drug at a time for one particular patient group. But in the end, when these drugs are legally available as prescriptions, what we hope is that people will develop kind of personalized psychedelic medicine. They'll, say, they'll talk about it with the therapist, will talk about it with the patients, and they'll say, let's start with MDMA, then let's see when we're ready to go to MDMA, psilocybin or LSD. Maybe you end up with MDMA, maybe you do a ketamine system experience within that. So I think that we need to develop a new specialty. Now, the credentials that are going to be required right now, we're negotiating with FDA. They are starting to permit some work with psilocybin where 4 or 5 people are treated at the same time, but each in their own room, each with one person instead of 2. And then there's several people that roam that are sort of more of the experts that will then consult if the one therapist with the one patient needs help or needs advice. So they're simultaneously treated in different rooms, but it's really still individual therapy. The skills that we need, a lot of times people really have to unlearn what they've learned, because what we call our method, there's a treatment manual. We've standardized it. We have a manual. We have adherence criteria. We have sort of therapist competencies of what we think people should be doing and learning, and those are reflected in the adherence criteria. And all that is posted on the MAPS website. So if you go to the MAPS website under research, then you go to the MDMA, and then at the bottom of the MDMA page, it's called the treatment manual. And the core hypothesis is that in an 8-hour session, that we call it inner-directed therapy. Before that, we were calling it non-directive therapy. So it's not script. It's more like Freudian free association, you could say, but catalyzed by a psychedelic. So in an 8-hour session, people are listening to music. They have eye shades on usually. And of an 8-hour session, about half the time people are eyes closed, having an incredible flow of imagery, metaphors, experiences, bodily sensations. And the other half of the time, they're talking to the therapists and explaining what's going on or asking questions or just describing what's been happening. With psilocybin or LSD, it's more like of an 8-hour session, maybe 80 to 90% of it, sometimes even more, people are quiet, having this inner experience, and there's a lot less dialogue between the patients and the therapist. That happens afterwards. So we do like this idea that people understand meditation, mindfulness, that the therapists often need to be quiet. I mean, during this period of time that they're sitting with the patients when they're having this inner experience, about every hour you check in to see how they're doing, but you're looking at body language, you're looking at, are they letting the energy flow through them? So there has to be people that are comfortable being quiet while the focus of attention is on the patient. So the training program that we have has got 5 parts to it. The first part is about a 14-hour online where you learn about our treatment manual, learn the history of MDMA, history of PTSD, a little bit of neuroscience. The next is a week-long program watching videotapes of therapy sessions and talking about the kind of interventions that the therapist did. Then we have the opportunity for people to volunteer to take MDMA. We think that that should always be optional. We're never going to require that. We don't think it's essential, but we think it's very helpful. Then we also have role play exercises that people do, which are videotaped, and then they send the videotapes to us and we review the videotapes and then give feedback. And then the final part of the training is where people work with a PTSD patient and they're supervised by our therapy training team while they're doing that. And so they watch the videotapes of the non-drug sessions and some of the first drug session. And then within a matter of a couple of weeks, we have our adherence raters watch the videotapes and talk to our supervisors, and then they talk to our trainers. Then they give feedback to the patients, and then we watch what they do with the second session or the third session. I think the most important thing is that people have done their own work, that the therapists have done their own work, so that if the patient is getting near sensitive material that you have not addressed in yourself, it could trigger you, and it could produce a certain kind of resistance in your own self for them going deeper, because it kind of triggers your own self. And patients are exquisitely aware of their therapists when they're in a psychedelic state. So we do feel that a big part of the training is people that have done their own work in non-ordinary states, have faced a lot of their own inner shadows, and found that these things that are so scary, that you can bring them to the surface and try to integrate, and you can come to a better balance. Now, of the 2 people, what we want to end up with, the 2 therapists, is one is a licensed therapist, the other is an intern or a student working like an apprentice and working for a lot less money than the first person, or working for free. We like the safety and added efficacy of 2 therapists. They're not twice as good as 1 therapist. Most underground therapists are just 1 person. Most therapists are just 1 person, unless it's a group therapy context. But we'd like to keep the 2-session model, but we want the second person to be an apprentice.
Okay, so there is space for non-clinicians and alternative healers to participate and to be involved in clinical work. And I know MAPS has this very strong focus on the medical, the therapeutic model, but there's also the harm reduction and the recreational aspect of MAPS as the Zendo project. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I would love to. Thank you for bringing us around to that, Gisele. That is really good. And that's part of our mission is mass mental health. That's how we started talking about it, helping humanity evolve. And there's 2 main aspects of that. Again, medicalization of psychedelics for clinical uses, and then licensed legalization to help people have these experiences on their own within a context where there's pure drugs, where there's honest drug education, and where there's harm reduction. So the harm reduction aspect is something that we realized that we're actually, this is about 20 years ago, I was starting to think about where could there be a backlash to stop what we're doing. there was a backlash in the 60s. The backlash was more for political reasons. A lot of people think backlash was because psychedelics went wrong and a bunch of people had difficult experiences or emotional breakdowns. That did happen, but the backlash was psychedelics going right and people having these spiritual interconnected experiences and then getting politically motivated to work on social justice against the Vietnam War. So the crackdown there was political. Where there could be a backlash now, and where the drug war has been focused, is it's on scaring parents about their kids doing drugs. We got to protect the kids. So a lot of young people go to festivals and a lot of them take psychedelics and a lot of them are not prepared for what they're doing. And they end up having difficult experiences and they end up often going to the medical staff. They get tranquilized, they get evacuated, they get potentially arrested. And so we're trying to have a whole new model in society of psychedelic harm reduction. And that's one of our donors, Vanya Palmers, who is an expert in Zen meditation. He's done some incredible work combining psychedelics with Zen, but he donated a cardboard Zendo for us at Burning Man for our 20th anniversary in 2006. And that became where we do the psychedelic harm reduction. That's how we got it called the Zendo Project. So we are now about to expand the Zendo Project. The training is run by therapists who have worked on phase 3. So it's very similar therapeutic approach to helping people that have difficult experiences when they took it in a recreational setting. So it's really designed to facilitate this larger group of people taking MDMA outside of therapeutic contexts, but how do we help society manage that? So for example, Denver has made mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. Oakland has decriminalized plant psychedelics. Ann Arbor has now gone forward to decriminalize plant psychedelics. The Oregon Psilocybin Initiative is going to be on the ballot to see whether a whole new kind of state license program is going to be created for guides and therapists to give people psilocybin who may or may not have a clinical indication. So in all of these cases, we really need to develop harm reduction methods because we want these social experiments in drug policy reform to succeed. And if there's a lot of people having these difficult experiences, that could cause a lot of backlash. And so the Zendo project has been extremely successful. At Burning Man, for example, Burning Man this year was just canceled, but the year before, we had over 800 people apply to volunteer, and we picked around 250 people to volunteer at Zendo. We had 2 different locations, 24/7 for 7 days. It was staffed. About 550 people came for help. And so we think we really need to make this larger. And Sarah Gale, who really helped develop the Zendo project, lives in Boulder, was a phase 2 MDMA PTSD therapist working on phase 3. And we now have a contract with the city of Denver where Sarah is going to be educating the police, the emergency room doctors, the EMTs, the firefighters, the first responders are going to be educated now in how to handle and de-escalate problems with people having difficult trips and how to avoid arresting them, tranquilizing them. We'll have people that they can turn them over to, and we'll teach them about how to really handle that. So the harm reduction is really a very important policy as far as helping society move forward as we integrate these drugs and as we make them more widely available. And the reason that we have to use the word harm reduction is talking about benefit enhancement is like, oh, you're trying to encourage illegal use. But it's basically the same therapeutic approach. It is designed to help people get more benefits, but it is designed to reduce the harms. But we speak about it as harm reduction for political reasons.
Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful initiative and important model, complementary. And so talking about models and paradigms, the structure of MAPS, both as a philanthropic
or
nonprofit organization and as a corporation. How is that? What are the blessings and the curses of operating under 2 different paradigms, Rick?
Well, your questions are terrific. Let me just say that. I'm very glad to respond to this. So right now we have about 100 people at MAPS and the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation. So MAPS was started in April 1986. The Public Benefit Corporation, we started it in December 2014. And why we did that is right now about 2/3 of our staff works at the Public Benefit Corporation and 1/3 works at the nonprofit. But the nonprofit is the 100% owner of the for-profit, the Benefit Corporation. The reason that we created the Benefit Corporation was because of a policy actually that Ronald Reagan signed into law in 1984. And the FDA was to provide incentives for people for developing drugs that are off patent. MDMA, invented by Merck in 1912, the molecule is off patent. In the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, I hired a patent attorney to develop an anti-patent strategy for the uses of MDMA. So all the uses of MDMA will be in the public domain. But what the law that Reagan signed into law was it provided what's called data exclusivity. So what that meant is that if you make a drug into a medicine, even if there's no patent protection, nobody can use your data for a certain period of time to market a generic drug. So that we have exclusive use of the data. Somebody else could develop their own data, but it'll take them 5 years or more. It'll cost them 2 or 3 times as much as it costs us because we have so many volunteers and people giving their time and working for less than market. And so we've raised over $100 million in donations in the history of MAPS, $100 million in donations.
Impressive.
But one of the things that's been important to the donors is to say that there are an endless number of uses of MDMA. Maybe not endless, but an enormous number of applications. And if we just keep needing to come to donors, we will exhaust the donors. So we thought, okay, because we have data exclusivity as an opportunity, we can decide that we will sell MDMA at a profit, and we will use the profits for more research and for the mission of MAPS, so that we will become, if not completely sustainable, we will supplement philanthropy with earned income from the sale of MDMA. Now, that the profit motive has warped healthcare in America beyond all good sense, beyond all recognition. We have the most expensive per capita expenses in the world for healthcare, but our outcomes are like 40 or 50 among the countries because we leave so many people out, and so many people are not insured. And so I think when you maximize profits in healthcare, you're really doing a disservice. And so what we wanted to do is, on the one hand, demonstrate a new approach to mental illness, which is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but also a new approach to marketing pharmaceutical medicines, where they are marketed in a public benefit way, where we maximize public benefit, not profit. And also where the whole for-profit company is owned by the nonprofit. So that's our corporate structure. People make donations to the nonprofit and get a tax deduction. The nonprofit then invests or transfers the funds to the for-profit. The for-profit spends the money on the research, and then, assuming the research works out and we get permission to market MDMA, the for-profit will market MDMA. That's something that is taxable. We couldn't keep that inside the MAPS, the nonprofit. We could have if we wanted to sell the MDMA at cost, but we felt like for raising the sums of money that we need to raise and for speaking to the donors that, so we call that the virtuous circle in a way, that people donate to the nonprofit, get a tax deduction, and then we invested in a wholly owned for-profit company. And as I said, we've got 100 people, 2/3 in the Benefit Corp, and a lot of them, we call them the refugees from Big Pharma. We have a lot of expertise from Big Pharma. The sweetest thing actually is that a lot of them are the senior leadership team. A lot of them has come from Novartis. And what's so nice about that is that Novartis is the company that bought Sandoz. And Sandoz is the company that Albert Hoffman worked at, where he invented LSD and then also synthesized psilocybin and figured out what was in the mushroom.
Fascinating. And I have to begin to wrap up with you my own questions and open up for the questions of the audience, but I can't help it because you're right there. The patent for psilocybin, what are your thoughts on that and the development of that? And how does MAP differ from Compass model?
Yeah. Well, first off, psilocybin itself is in the public domain. I mean, it was invented in 58 by Albert Hofmann, and that's when he figured out the psilocybin. So what Compass has patented is not the psilocybin, but the process of manufacturing the psilocybin, so that you can have composition of matter patents. That's when you invented a molecule, those have expired. Then you can get all these use patents. Much of that is in the public domain. The process patents is what Compass has. USONA, the nonprofit organization that's developing psilocybin, has decided to take their method of synthesis and make it public for making psilocybin. So the patent that Compass has on the manufacturing of psilocybin is just about their method, and it doesn't block other people from coming up with other methods. Compass is now talking about the possibility of patenting psilocybin for use for certain kind of uses. But a lot of those uses are in the public domain. And I think what Compass is going to be patenting is going to be sort of a unique combination of digital technologies, psilocybin therapy. So I am in general sympathetic with people, if they want to, patenting their original inventions. If the patents are used to block other people from doing things, if they're overbroad patents, I don't think that's a good thing. But if they take money from investors, and Compass has now raised over $200 million from investors, and we'll see. But I don't think that their use patents are going to block anything that USONA wants to do. So I'm not actually that concerned about it. But MAPS' approach has been different, again, because we don't have investors. We don't have to return money to investors. We want mass mental health. If people want to adopt our methods or improve on them, we want to foster the whole field. So we're not going to try to block anybody from doing anything. And in fact, all the things that we're doing, we're going to be putting in the public domain, like our treatment manual, our survey of the literature of MDMA, our protocols are up on the web. All of these things are designed to facilitate other people following in what we're doing and maybe even improve on it.
That's fair. And so sometimes it gets a little political, yeah? And I've heard you talking about psychedelics being a bipartisan issue.
Yes.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, okay. We all know, or maybe many of us know, that when one of the more progressive members of the U.S. House of Representatives is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. One of the more conservative pro-Trump members of Congress is Matt Gaetz from Florida. So one of the only bipartisan things that has happened in Congress is that AOC and Matt Gaetz got together to sponsor a bill to try to make it easier to do research with psychedelics.
That's fantastic.
Now, the bill was not passed by the House of Representatives, but there is bipartisan support. We also have got bipartisan funding. Rebecca Mercer on one hand, who was a big Trump and Bannon supporter, all the way on one side, the other side, George Soros, who funded us to do a training for therapists of color. So we have bipartisan support, and also the fact that the people who have PTSD, as I said, roughly 60+% are women with domestic violence or sexual abuse, but also a substantial number are veterans with war-related PTSD. So our patient populations also are appreciated by a bipartisan group of the public. So I think it's been very important to think about and try to get people focused on healing as a bipartisan endeavor. You know, we all want to see healing. And also when we start thinking about the treatment of addiction, psychedelics can make a major role in the treatment of addiction. And there's people across the political spectrum that get into trouble with dependence on different drugs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. So we're moving on to the questions from the audience right now, as we have people from all over the country, all over the world that are tuning in. And the first question I'm going to read comes from Austin. What are some ways that mental health providers can honor, collaborate with, and contribute to the indigenous people who inspired the use of psychedelics as psychiatric medicine?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to honor the origins. I will say, though, that the origins of psychedelics, as far as we know, go back thousands of years. And when we talk about integrating mainstreaming psychedelics into Western culture, the origins of Western culture were the Greeks. And from roughly 1600 BC to 396 AD, we had the Eleusinian Mysteries, which everybody that we think of as Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, all the sort of foremost Greek philosophers and scientists and thinkers, they all participated in the Eleusinian Mysteries that had a psychedelic component to it. They drank a potion called Kykeon. So I think that what we're thinking about now is like the Native American church, the ones that have really tried to develop peyote. And then before that, Mexicans, peyote goes way back. Also, South America, where ayahuasca came from. So I think that we honor them by trying to make sure that the Western demand for these psychedelics, that it doesn't deplete them, it doesn't endanger them, it doesn't make them so expensive that the people who develop these ayahuasca in particular, or peyote, or the use of mushrooms, that they can still afford it. We have to sometimes try to see about honoring where it came from. On the other hand, I'll say that I am a Jewish person in the Reformed tradition, and what that means is that it's our obligation to take the traditions of the past and make them relevant to the challenges of the present. So that's different, of course, than Orthodox Jews who want to keep things, or fundamentalists from every religion. So I would say that the ayahuasca, as it was used in South America, was not this pure from nature kind of religious use. They were dominated and subjugated by the conquistadors, by Catholics, and so a lot of the by the missionaries, not just Catholics but Protestants, the traditions they're called syncretic. So they've kind of grafted on a lot of Christian symbology and onto a lot of these earlier indigenous practices. The ayahuasca churches have been homophobic, patriarchal, hierarchical. They need to they needed to survive in these very delicate situations. So they've needed to make some compromises. So I think that we honor where these things come from. We try to make sure that they still have access. In some situations, there can even be certain payments from profits back to the cultures to sustain them. But I don't think that we need to use their methods. I don't think it's inappropriate cultural appropriation to modify what they've done. And I will say that there was an incredible study that was done in Brazil with ayahuasca for depression, and it got really good results, but it was done in a hospital without any ceremony whatsoever. And yet they still got good results. So it's a delicate situation, but I think from my perspective, MDMA came from the lab. It doesn't appear in nature. There's no other culture that's used it. So we need to really develop our own contexts. But I do think that I'll just say one other thing. There's sometimes the traditional cultures, they have power dynamics that I think are a little bit uncomfortable to Westerners. So our method of therapy is this inner-directed therapy. We support the emergence of what's happening. We believe in an inner healing intelligence. We support what's emerging. We don't guide people to certain kind of experiences. We support what's happening. And we say that people are doing the hard work themselves. They are doing the work to heal themselves. In certain shamanistic cultures, sometimes the shaman is the one that takes the drug and they do the healing. So that's what I mean by power dynamics. We want to help people heal themselves and learn how to do that on their own continually as they go through life without having to come back to us. That's ideal. So it's I've sort of gone on a bit far, but it is a delicate situation. Yeah, how do we honor where it came from, but also modify it for our own cultural use?
And maintain respect and find ways to give back in
Yeah.
ways that will continue to preserve and sustain the places where these medicines come from. So I heard that
Yes.
also.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll just say that David Bronner and Cody Swift, Dr. Bronner's and Cody from River Styx, have joined together with others, and they've bought large plots of land, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres in the Texas-Mexico border areas where peyote grows, to provide for the Native American church and others in traditional cultures to have access to peyote, because peyote is becoming endangered. And we need to develop gardens for the plants that ayahuasca is used. And iboga, the iboga root is becoming endangered. So yeah, there are a lot of needs that need to be thought of in terms of protecting access to the substances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So here, moving on to another question of an enthusiast who wants to be helpful in assisting the legal the psychedelic movement going forward. And the question is, what's the best way? Is it doing research? Is it getting involved in politics? Or is it working to provide it to individuals?
Well, I think we need all of that. So, everybody has their own point of leverage. So it's not like there's one right way. If you're a scientist and you're a therapist and you understand clinical research, then maybe doing research. I will say that there's something that everybody can do. It's for some people that it's going to be more difficult than others, but what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years has been incredible progress with gay rights, to the point where the Supreme Court has said that there can be gay marriage. What made that work was people coming out. So we need a massive coming out of the psychedelic community. There are so many people that have been positively influenced in their life by psychedelics that you would never anticipate. Republican politicians, incredibly successful business people, scientists, and all sorts of people have had incredibly helpful, transformative psychedelic experiences. And we don't know about that. So I'd say everybody can think about, if you want to do this, coming out to your family, to your friends, to your members of your family that might think badly about you for saying this. And that's how large scale social transformation happens, by individuals, and many, many of them doing this kind of work. We do need the research. We do need more funding. We do need public education. But I'd say one of the things that I really like about what we're doing now in this CIIS program is that we really need public education. We need people to understand that these are tools that they can be used poorly, but they can also be used wisely, and that prohibition is counterproductive. So I think for those people that can have a platform and do public education, that's particularly important. We do need more researchers, but I'd say the biggest need for scaling is going to be more therapists. So we really need to think about training more therapists, and that's what CIIS is trying to do. And so I'd say for all of those people that are thinking about where they might be helpful, the biggest need is going to be therapists that are trained to deliver psychedelic psychotherapy.
Okay. And last question here from John Hart. He wants to know about he's under the impression the effects on the brain how are these effects permanent if
Yes.
the state wears off? So he's curious about the healing process and the healing properties. And
okay, that's a tremendous question. And because I've described how many hours of therapy it is, if it was only temporary and it wore off after a month or 2 or 3, then it would never be cost effective. And we would maybe get it approved, but no insurance companies would pay for it. So what we believe is going on that can make these things long lasting, we have done some studies at 3.5-year follow-ups. We're about to do a study of our phase 2 people, some of whom treated 15 years ago. And so we know that permanent transformations can be effectuated in a relatively short period of time. But what I think is actually going on is people are rewiring their brains. So what I described, the neuroscientist from Johns Hopkins who talked about MDMA triggering oxytocin, and then oxytocin producing new neural connections in prosocial areas of the brain. We see that with psilocybin. We see that with other psychedelics. They open up, they make the brain more neuroplasticity. They make it more flexible. Your old patterns are no longer the same, but you are also layering in new pathways for thinking about different kind of memories. So with MDMA for PTSD, I'll say specifically, it's a process of fear extinction and memory reconsolidation. And so what that means is that when you have a traumatic memory, it's stored in different parts of the brain. You have what's called episodic memory, what happened, but you also have the emotion that's attached to it. And then when these become PTSD or traumatic memories, people can't properly place them in the past. They're always about to happen. They're always worried that this sound is actually a bomb, or that this person who looks like, wearing a red hat and you were assaulted by somebody with a red hat, that's about happening again. So people's process of putting traumatic memories into long-term storage is inhibited as well. So what we can do is the MDMA reduces the fear. You can approach the memory in a different way. And then when you reconsolidate the memory, what you're doing is you've placed the memory in the past. MDMA enhances memory so that you can actually remember more of the trauma because it's not so painful to do that. And when you're looking at a memory that was painful, but now you're coming at it from a period of and a perspective of peace and acceptance, then when you reconsolidate the memory, you've swapped out the emotion of fear with this emotion of peace and acceptance. It's part of my story, but it doesn't define me. And you've also been able to move it from amygdala to hippocampus to long-term storage. So now it's a memory that's happened in the past. It's not about to happen. And so these things can happen in one MDMA session or one psilocybin session. You can rewire. So we started earlier talking about electroconvulsive therapy. That's a similar kind of a story. You break the circuits that are sort of stuck in these destructive patterns. A lot of times those patterns reemerge after a period of years or decades. But with psychedelic psychotherapy, there's the opportunity to actually rewire your brain in more spiritual, pro-social areas of the brain. And that can be long lasting. Now, maybe somebody has a relapse. Maybe they need one MDMA session 5 years later, or something new traumatic has happened. So we're not saying that what you can do in a session will then impact the whole rest of your life for sure, no matter what else happens to you. But it should be easier the second time or third time around to do the therapy to get you back because you've already healed once before. So that's our hope.
Mm-hmm. It's an important balance to know that there's no quick fix, and so that people don't get under the impression that they can just go and do one session and then everything will get resolved, because it's a complex process in healing.
Although I'll just share a very fast story, which was part of my TED Talk, if people want to see that. So I already did mention it there, but it's how somebody changed permanently after one session. So this was a veteran who had PTSD for multiple years, and he got basically disabled. Wasn't able to do a lot of function, didn't function well. And under the influence of MDMA, in his very first session, which turned out to be his only session, which was now about 8 or 9 years ago, he still doesn't have PTSD. What he realized was that there was a benefit that he was getting from PTSD. The benefit was that that was how he was showing loyalty to his friends who had died. And that was how he was honoring their memory. As long as he was sort of suffering, he was going through this pain, he was thinking about his friends who had died, he was honoring their memory. And he was able to look at himself from the eyes of his dead friends. And he realized that they would not want him, they could not live, they were dead. They wouldn't want him to squander his life by suffering. They would want him to live, and they could live through him. And so he said, I can honor my friends in a different way by living rather than by suffering. I will not forget them, but I can honor them in a different way. And now, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? And in that moment, he cured himself of PTSD. In the next moment, he said, I've been taking opiates for pain, and I don't really think I need these for pain. I'm taking them more to escape. I don't need the opiates anymore, and I don't need MDMA anymore, and I want to drop out of the study after one session, and I don't need MDMA anymore. And that was, as I said, 7 or 8 years ago. He's not done MDMA since, and he doesn't have PTSD. So that kind of one dose miracle cure is very rare. And we don't want people to expect that that will happen. He still had to do a bunch of integration work on his own. But there are those rare cases. So I just want to say that can happen.
It's a beautiful story. It's what happens in phase 3 of trauma treatment, is the mini making of the traumatic experience and being able to re-engage in life in a different way with different capacities. So very well illustrated there. There's one more question from the audience, and it is, what is the best way to start working towards being licensed to be a psychedelic therapist? What training opportunities do you see for students graduating in the next few years who want to intern or work in this field?
Well, I would say, first off, you can go to our website, and we have a place where people can send in their emails to be on our list of therapists that want training. I would say right away, start reading our treatment manual. There's a tremendous movie called Trip of Compassion that's focused on 3 of our Israeli patients who were treated with MDMA. There's English subtitles. That's a great way to understand about the process. We will be wanting to train thousands and thousands of therapists. So the best way is to become a therapist, first off, to experiment legally, what you can now with holotropic breathwork, with hyperventilation that Stan Grof has developed. So there are certain doorways to non-ordinary states of consciousness that are completely legal, that are involving breathwork. So you can explore that. You can explore meditation. You can have your own experiences. I think that's going to be really important, to do your own healing with psychedelics. But the sponsors of the research, meaning USONA, Compass, MAPS, other companies that are coming into this, are going to be having training programs for therapists, because each sponsor is going to have slightly different therapeutic approach, different training programs. And so I think check in with the sponsors of this research and see about their training programs. We are trying to develop more alliances like we have with CIIS for their program. We've got part of our training has been embedded in the CIIS program, in the psychedelic research and therapy program. We just are right now are doing something in association with Naropa, where we've also done this week-long, more or less week-long training of watching videotapes and talking about therapeutic sessions. And Naropa has added some training with their own professors about mindfulness. So I think that Harvard, Yale, UCSF, UC Berkeley, Medical University of South Carolina, so many universities are now wanting to set up psychedelic research centers, and they're all also interested in training therapists. So I think the best way to prepare yourself is to really look at the treatment methods, the treatment manuals that we have. Maybe go through the Zendo program training for harm reduction, because it's similar principles. And apply to be trained in these different ways. Now, right now, we're mostly training people who are doing research. We do have permission for compassionate use, which is called expanded access for 50 people. So now we're training more people for that. We hope once we've treated 35 people, we submit it to FDA, we get permission for more compassionate use, and we will use that to train more people. So we're eventually going to anticipate, 8,000 psychedelic treatment centers throughout the United States and Canada. Each of them could have, 6 or 8 psychedelic therapists. So, 50, 60,000 people or more we're going to need to train. So it's a challenge for us because there are only a few legal opportunities where people can be supervised actually working with patients. So it's going to start slow, but it's going to increase, and it'll increase dramatically in a couple of years once, if we are able to get FDA to approve these drugs as prescription medicines.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rick, for being here tonight, for all the work that you have been doing, for inspiring, for training, for opening frontiers, for healing, for not only the mental health field, but society in general. And
Well, and I guess I would like to thank all those underground psychedelic therapists who've kept the flame alive. You can also, if you can find them, apprentice with underground psychedelic therapists, but that there's been a lot of people with courage who have decided that for ethical reasons, they need the best tools available to work with their patients, even if they're against the law. So I do think that there's been a large number of people that have kept the flame alive over these dark decades when things were completely squashed. And now things are coming to the surface. And I just think we have a very good chance at a time of great need to mainstream psychedelics.
So since we're giving our gratitudes here to you, to the movement, to all of those who have been working, to CIIS for sponsoring, and all these different institutions who have been supporting the work, for all the donors, all the people who have been involved. Let's give thanks also to our ancestors, those who came before us, those who have been doing this work for a long time, those who continue to protect and guide us in this path.
That's beautiful. And I would like to bring to mind Stan Groff. So Stan is now 89. He's really been the keeper of the flame in the darkest days, the developer of holotropic breath work. I think Stan has been my mentor. He's mentored a lot of the people that have really started psychedelic research, psychedelic psychotherapy, Michael Mithoever, George Greer, Charlie Grubb, Bill Richards. There's a lot of people to give gratitude to, and we are looking forward to all sorts of new people to do tremendous things that we can then be grateful for as well.
Yeah, so gratitude to our teachers, to our mentors, to those who influenced us, who inspired us, who taught us, and to those who are going to come after us and continue this work.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Rick, for being here.
Thank you, Gisele. Terrific questions. It's been a pleasure to speak with you and with everybody listening tonight.
Same here. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you all so much for attending today. We hope you will join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded. If you would like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this same link and on our Facebook page later. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful night.